Hey guys, Jocelyn here with Fantasia Elegance with the promised tutorial on this pendant necklace. It is a somewhat beginner to intermediate level project, so if you haven't done any wire weaving or wire wrapping before, you might want to check out some of my previous videos, but I will try and gear this as much towards beginners as I can. But let's go ahead and jump right into making this pendant. So as we get started, you are going to need your standard chain nose pliers, round nose pliers, and flush cutters. And do check in the description section below. I have listed the exact ones I'm using. And another tool that might be helpful but is optional is a steel bench block and jeweler's hammer. And you'll also, of course, need a ruler and tape measure, something to measure out wire with. So go ahead and get some of those handy. And you're also going to need wire, obviously. We're going to need 18 gauge round dead soft. I will be using sterling silver from Rio Grande. And you'll also need some 28 gauge round dead soft. And again, you can use whatever kind you like as long as it is round dead soft, 18 and 28 gauge. And then you're also going to need a few little bead crystals. I'm going to be using Swarovski crystals, the bicones, in a graduation of purple colors. You do need 4 in different sizes. I'll be using 6, 5, 4, and 3 millimeter. And you'll also need some beads in a graduation of sizes. I'm going to have 5 different sizes, ranging from 4 millimeter all the way down to 2 millimeter. And I will be using sterling silver beads purchased from Rio Grande to match the color of wire I'm using. So go ahead and pull out your 18 gauge wire. We're going to cut some lengths of this. We're going to start by cutting a 5.5 inch length, and for those of you using metric, that's just about 14 centimeters. So we'll go ahead and snip that off with our flush cutters, just like so. And then for our first bend, I'm going to measure so you can see where to make this. We're going to make our first bend at just about 3 inches. And again, in metric, that's going to be about 7.5 centimeters. So go ahead and mark that with your fingers, and then pull out your chain nose pliers. And that's where we're going to make our first really tight U-shaped bend. And I'm going to go ahead and crimp that on down again with my chain nose pliers so the wires are really smushed together. And we're making the bottom point of that marquise shape for the pendant. So I'm going to open it up a little bit with my round nose pliers now, just like so. And you may need to help flatten this out with your chain nose pliers, depending on if the wires went wonky when you were opening them up. And I'm going to just start making a kind of leaf shape here. And you may want to switch to your chain nose pliers. I find I get a little bit better control with those than the round nose, and they seem to leave somewhat fewer marks in the wire. And I'm also just using my fingers here to put that leaf shape in, just trying to keep it symmetrical and pleasing to the eye on either side. And I do find that sterling silver is soft and malleable enough that I can shape it with my fingers like this. If you're having a little bit of trouble doing that with whatever wire you're using, feel free to switch over to your round nose pliers or chain nose pliers as needed. So at this point, we're going to start making little swirls with the tails, but I want to go ahead and measure just so you can kind of get a gauge for how much length you should have on your tails here, so that you can follow along and make sure that you wind up with the right amount of wire. So I'm going to start with the longer of the two tails, and I'm going to swirl it kind of towards the outside left of the pendant, just like so. And I'm going to make an open swirl. And you might want to use your chain nose pliers to refine that as you're going. So you should have something like that. And then let's go ahead and do the shorter one. We're going to swirl it in the opposite direction of that first swirl we made, but again making a very open swirl with it. And you want the two swirls to meet each other just like that. So you should have something looking like this now, and I'm going to go ahead and measure once again so that you can get a ballpark idea of how large your pendant should be at this point. Trying to show both metric and US there. Alright, so go ahead and put that aside. We're going to now cut another length of our 18 gauge wire. This one's going to be 2.5 inches long, or about 6.6 centimeters. Go ahead and snip that with your flush cutters. And now with this one we're going to put in kind of a little wave shape, and this will be the center wire that goes right down the middle of our leaf-shaped pendant. So I'm just starting out by putting in a little wave where it curls a bit at the bottom, and then waves twice up above that little lower one. And this is how it's going to sit on the pendant, just like that. And I'm going to go ahead and hammer this out, just that little wave portion we made. And this step is optional, but I feel like it makes the finished product look a lot more just polished and sturdy, and I really like to hammer this out. And I'm also going to do that frame we made earlier, just hammering that out lightly to flatten it out a little bit. And I'm going to do mainly the lower leaf-shaped portion, but then also a little bit on the swirls as well. There we go. And you might need to fix it up a little bit. Things always lose their shape somewhat as you're hammering them. That's pretty expected. So I'm just refining it here with my chain nose pliers, making sure everything is back to how I want it. There we go. So you should have something like that, and your little top wire should be fitting like that. So at this point we're going to sand off that bottom portion, just because it can be a little bit sharp and catch on clothing otherwise. So I'm just using a cheap little emery board I got from Walmart. You could use a metal file or sanding paper or really anything just to smooth off that end. So here's how we're going to put the thing together. And we have this little tail. We're going to actually wrap that around the two base wires of the leaf-shaped frame. So I'm putting in a little bend and then bending it perpendicularly the other way so that we can start wrapping that tail around to connect both of those wires in between the two swirls. So I'm going to use my chain nose pliers to start wrapping that, and I like to wrap, I don't know, three times or so. And I'm making sure it's very snug as I go by securing between each wrap with my chain nose pliers. And this part is a little bit tricky because you want to make sure that the other end, that kind of wavy end, is still lying where you want it to, in the middle of the pendant. So you might need to make little adjustments as you go to preserve that shape, and also be mindful of how you are wrapping it. If you wrap too much, you might end up with a shorter piece to cover your pendant than what you were expecting. So just periodically double check and make sure that you're not wrapping so tightly that you're starting to steal wire from that bottom swoop bit. So as you can see, I'm making a lot of little adjustments as I go to make sure that I'm pleased with the final result. And once you are, you can just snip off that little bit, smush it down on the back of the pendant. Just check that it's not sharp with your finger. And I'm going to tighten up these swirls a little bit too. I wasn't completely happy with how they were lying. So you should have something looking like this now. So that's our frame done. Next we're going to move on to the wire weaving portion. So go ahead and pull out your 28 gauge wire, and we're going to feed a long length of this off of the coil because we need to cut a fairly long length. Now some people like to coil their weaving wire on a bobbin or something. I just kind of estimate how much I'm going to need and cut a long length, so I'm going to cut 3 feet or 1 yard. You might need a little more, a little less, but there is a way to splice in more wire if you need to. So to start with, I'm just going to start wrapping about 2 inches or so of the end, and I'm going to be capturing both the leftmost frame wire and that central wavy wire with these wraps. I'm going to wrap it around several times until I feel like that is secured on that end. And I'm doing each wrap over those two wires right next to the previous wrap, so I'm smushing it all together with my chain nose pliers there to make sure that all my wires are lying right next to each other, just like so. And once I have this end secured, we're going to start doing a figure 8 weave, going back and forth between the leftmost frame wire and the center wavy wire. So if you haven't done a figure 8 weave before, you aren't familiar with it, I do go over that in somewhat more detail on the previous tutorial I posted on the woven bale. So go ahead and check that out if you're having a little bit of trouble with this figure 8 weave. And of course there are a ton of other tutorials on YouTube for wire weaving. I'm not an expert on it yet by any means. But basically we're going to be wrapping this weaving wire 3 or 4 times around the leftmost frame wire, and then we're going to transfer it across that gap over to the central wavy wire, and we're going to wrap it 3 or 4 times around the center wire, and then we'll transfer it back across the gap to the leftmost frame wire, and we're just going to repeat that, and the wire will make a figure 8 shape on the frame wires and in that space between the two of them. And you can make this weave look more or less open depending on how many wraps you do in between transferring the wire in between that open space. So I like to do about 4 on this design. I feel like that gives me the openness of the weave that I like best. And one thing I like about this, it's easy to wrap that weaving wire around the loose wavy wire because there's room to just wrap it around without having to feed the end through that space and feed all that wire through and try to not get kinks. And I'm just kind of pushing down the weave as I go to make sure that it's staying neat and tidy. There we go. And if you get any kinks, you can very gently smooth them out with your fingers. Or if you have nylon jawed or nylon coated pliers, you can run those along your weaving wire as well to get out any kinks. But we're just going to continue this figure 8 weave all the way down the rest of that space. So go ahead and follow along with me on that, and we will come back once we're getting close to the end of filling in this space with that figure 8 weave. Alright, so I am almost all the way at the end, and as you can see, I'm a little bit short on wire, unfortunately, but I realize this is a helpful opportunity to show you how to splice on a little bit more weaving wire if you run out. So basically, I'm going to cut off this tail when it's wrapped twice around that center wavy wire. So I've got 2 wraps there, and I'm going to snip off the end. And I kind of want to make sure that that end is winding up on the back, and I'm going to smush it down really firmly with my chain nose pliers to make sure that there's no loose end that can possibly catch on anything. And the key to splicing on more wire is to make sure that you continue the weave the way it's going. So I'm going to cut another little length. I only need a little bit more. I was pretty close on my estimation, unfortunately. If I had cut 6 more inches, I would have been fine. But we're going to wrap that end of the wire we're splicing on right next to the previous wrap. And since we're doing a 4 wraps between each weave, this will work perfectly to have the tails wrapped twice on the ending wire and wrapped twice on the beginning wire, and it will still space out our weave correctly, and yet both of those wire ends will be firmly attached on. And you want to make sure that you continue the figure 8 in the pattern that's been going. So I'm making sure that how my pattern worked out, I want this splicing wire to be coming on the overside of the central frame wire and then coming and going under the left side of the framing wire, because that's what will continue the pattern in my weave. So just study your weave if you need to splice in wire, and make sure that the way you do it is going to continue the pattern that you've been making. And we'll just continue on now that it's fastened as if we had cut a longer piece of weaving wire to begin with. And I'm going to continue weaving this all the way down until I run out of space to continue that weave in. There we go, and once you have finished your weave, when you have no more room there, we're just very simply going to end with wrapping that wire a few times around one of the frame wires, snipping it off on the back side, and again using your chain nose pliers to really firmly smush down that weaving wire. And I do have a little bit up top here that I never finished off, so I'm just going to tuck that in as tightly as I can. And this is where these tweezer nose pliers really come in handy. I like that they're so fine, they're easy to reach in little areas and deal with the wire ends. So you should have something looking like this now. So we're done with the frame, we're done with the weaving. All we need to do now is attach on our beads. So I'm going to cut another length of the 28 gauge wire. I'm going to cut 15 inches. And you might want to cut a little more just so you have some insurance, but I find this works for me. And we're going to take about 4 inches on the end of that and wrap it around those wraps we made earlier with the 18 gauge center wire. We're just going to cover that whole area up with that 28 gauge tail. And then I'm going to wrap the longer end around the right-sided frame wire. And I'm going to put in about a 1/4 inch or so of very tightly spaced wraps around that frame wire. Basically, I'm just bringing the wire down to the level I need so that I can start wrapping on the crystals. And again, you want about a 1/4 inch or so of space traveling down that frame wire. So now go ahead and take out your largest bead. Again, I'll be using a 6mm Swarovski bicone, but go ahead and take your largest one, place it on there, and we want it to kind of sit in that space that we've created. So I'm going to feed my weaving wire underneath and then wrap it around the right-hand frame to secure that crystal on there, just like so. And you might need to tighten it down with your chain nose pliers. And I find it helpful to hold the bead I'm placing right where I want it to go with my thumb as I'm wrapping the wire, just to make sure that it sits in the right place. And I'm going to secure that long tail around the frame 2 or 3 times with 2 or 3 wraps just to make sure that everything is secure. And it is also helping to space out because you want a little room between your first crystal and your next crystal. So go ahead and feed on your 5mm bead or crystal now. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to position it with our thumb to sit nice and flat in that empty space. We're going to tuck our weaving wire through so that we can wrap it around the right-sided frame wire there. And again, using your thumb will help you to hold the crystals in the right place and make sure you get the tension right and that there won't be any looseness or slack in the wire as you're wrapping here. So just go ahead and continue that process, working your way down to the smallest bead. We're going to again be putting about 4 wraps around that right-sided frame wire between each smaller sized bead that we add on. So I'm just going to continue that down until I get to my smallest crystal. So here we are. I've just placed my 3mm crystal, and I've wrapped that weaving wire several times around the frame wire, so I'm going to snip it off with my flush cutters as close as I can, and then secure that little end on down by smushing with your chain nose pliers. So you should have something looking like this now with 4 beads, and I'm going to space them out a little more by using my finger to just kind of push them on down, because I realized I wanted my smallest crystal to be sitting a little bit closer to the bottom of the pendant. So I'm kind of just spacing them out by easing the wire wraps to work them all down a little bit on the frame. And I'm just snipping off that tail up top that we didn't deal with earlier. So now go ahead and pull out your 28 gauge wire again. We're going to cut another 15-inch length. And we're going to use this length to attach those metal beads between the crystals. And we're going to do basically the same thing but in opposite directions. So again, I'm going to start with about a 4-inch tail on the top, and I'm going to wrap that around that central portion between the swirls. So at this point I'm going to take that tail and actually start wrapping it around the swirl portion, the leftmost swirl, and I'm going to secure that to the center part of the pendant with at least 4 or 5 wraps, because what we're going to do in a few minutes is add a bail on to that swirl in order to hang the pendant from a chain, of course, and we don't want any chance of that bail slipping off and allowing the pendant to fall off and get lost. So I'm just using this weaving wire tail end at this opportunity to really secure this using my chain nose pliers again to make sure that everything's tensioned and secure. There we go. And pardon the sudden light change coming up here. My camera battery died unexpectedly and I had to continue filming the next morning, so that's why there's a light change there. And then at this point I'm going to also wrap it around that smaller rightmost swirl. This part really isn't necessary. I just thought this would be a good place and a good opportunity to use up that little bit of wire I had left. So I'm wrapping it a few times around that right swirl portion. But you can really finish off that wire end wherever you think it looks good, as long as it is securely attached and there's no danger of it unraveling. You should be good to go. And I'm just going to snip it off there and secure that end. There we go. So now we have this other weaving wire. I'm going to wrap it a few times around the central wavy wire and the leftmost bail wire, just to kind of get it in position for adding our first and largest metal bead. So again, this is a 4mm sterling silver bead that I'm using. And I'm just going to slide that on the end there. And you want this one positioned right above that 6mm bead. So it should sit right there below the swirls in that whole junction. And we're going to actually feed this wire end through our 6mm bead here, just like so. And go slowly, make sure you don't get any kinks in your wire. And you should have enough space for 2 of the 28 gauge wires if you're using Swarovski bicones like I am. If you don't have enough room in the bead you're using, you can just expand that hole a little bit with a bead reamer beforehand. And now we're going to do the same thing with our next smallest bead. Again, just sliding it on the end here. There we go. And this one we're going to position in that spot between the largest and second largest crystals. And we're going to do the same thing with that end. And I'm just snugging things down, making sure everything's positioned there before I proceed. So you want your second bead to sit there. We're going to once again feed that wire end top to bottom through our second crystal. And another option, if you can't get that wire through the crystal, is to just wrap your weaving wire with the metal beads to wrap it over top of the other wraps on the right-hand frame wire. That would certainly work to secure it as well. I just think this looks pretty cool with the kind of crisscross wires going through the crystals like that. So you're going to continue on down until you get to your smallest crystal. And for this one, my wire did not fit twice through the 3mm crystal. So after adding on that smallest, or second smallest bead, I'm just going to wrap the wire a few times around the rightmost frame wire. And again, like I was saying, you could use this technique to secure all of the metal beads without even needing to feed your wire through the crystals. I just find that works well for me. So then this is our very smallest, our 2mm bead, which is pretty hard to feed on the wire because it's so small. But there we go. And we're just going to position that one to sit right below the smallest crystal. And just like we attached the crystals, we're going to wrap it around the frame just like that to secure it in place. And since this is the end of your wire that's holding all the beads on, you want to make sure you give it some really good secure wraps there to finish it off. Just so that if, one little bit comes unraveled, the whole thing won't detach. So I'm going to I think those need to be a little tighter. There we go. So I'm just going to snip off that end with my flush cutters and smooth down that last bit of wire. So there you go. You should have something looking like this now. And the final finishing step is to simply add a bail on. You could use a large jump ring, but I think it looks much more nicely finished if you use the figure 8 weave bail tutorial that I posted a few weeks ago. So that's what I will be using. Go ahead and check out that tutorial to see how to make it, and you'll again put it right on top of the swirl here. Go ahead and click the little gray lowercase I icon in the upper right hand corner of your screen to see that. So this is what it should look like with the bail on. I really hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial, found it relatively easy to follow. Please like and subscribe to my channel if you did enjoy it, and make sure you click that little bell icon to get notified about my future videos that are coming out. Thanks so much for watching, and happy crafting!